They mocked me in that courtroom, a frail old woman with nothing but my voice and my truth, and my son's face turned pale as stone. At that moment, I realized no one, not even my own blood, believed me. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Rose, and I am 78 years old. I live in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, where the morning subway rattles my coffee cup and the evening sirens sing me to sleep. The walls are thin here, thin enough that I can hear Mrs. Chen arguing with her teenage grandson next door, thin enough that my own loneliness echoes back to me like a question I can't answer. Every morning, I wake to the smell of roasted chestnuts from the vendor on the corner of Atlantic Avenue. That sweet, nutty aroma used to make me smile, back when I had someone to share those chestnuts with, back when my son Michael would visit with his wife Anna and my grandson Leo. Now that same smell just reminds me of all the Sundays they promised to come and never did. I spend my days pressed against the window of my third-floor apartment, watching the world rush by below. Brooklyn moves fast, always has. People hurry past with their phones pressed to their ears, their coffee cups steaming, their lives full of purpose. I wonder sometimes if they see me up here, an old woman in a faded blue housecoat, clutching photographs that grow more yellow each day. The photographs tell the story I wish were still true. There's Michael at 6 years old, gap-toothed and laughing on the Coney Island boardwalk. There's Anna in her wedding dress, radiant and hopeful, the day she promised to love my son forever. There's little Leo, born 10 years ago, his tiny fingers wrapped around mine in the hospital room where I held him first, before anyone else, whispering promises I thought I'd never break. I keep these photos in a shoebox next to my bed, taking them out each night like rosary beads, counting memories instead of prayers. The edges are soft now from so much handling, the face is beginning to fade, but I know every detail by heart. Michael's crooked smile, Anna's laugh lines, Leo's bright green eyes that mirror his grandmother's. The day everything fell apart started like any other. I made my morning coffee, black with 1 sugar because that's all the diabetes allows, and I sat at my little kitchen table with the morning sun streaming through the dirty window. The radiator clanked like an old friend clearing his throat. The pigeons cooed on the fire escape, normal sounds of a normal day, but my heart wasn't normal that morning. It was heavy with hope, the dangerous kind of hope that comes from loving someone who doesn't love you back the same way. I picked up my phone. The old flip phone Michael bought me 3 Christmases ago because he said smartphones were too complicated for someone my age. I typed carefully, the way I always do, checking each word twice. Would you like to come for Sunday dinner this week? I'll make your favorite pot roast. Simple words, innocent words. Words that carried 40 years of love and sacrifice, and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I pressed send and waited. The message showed delivered at 9:15 in the morning. I know because I watched those 3 little dots appear and disappear, like my son was starting to type, and then changing his mind, over and over again. By noon, no response. I told myself he was busy with work, with his family, with the important things that filled his life now. By 3 o'clock, I started cooking anyway, browning the roast, peeling potatoes, setting the table for 4, even though I knew, deep in that place where truth lives regardless of what we tell ourselves, that they wouldn't come. The pot roast filled my apartment with the smell of home, the smell of better times when my kitchen table was surrounded by voices and laughter instead of silence. I kept checking my phone every few minutes, the screen lighting up my face in the growing darkness, showing me the same thing over and over. Message delivered, no response. Evening came like it always does in Brooklyn, with the gradual glow of streetlights and the distant hum of traffic heading home to families that wanted them. I sat by my window, still in my good dress, the one I'd put on that morning thinking I'd have company, watching people hurry past with their grocery bags and their children and their lives that mattered to someone. The rain started around 7 o'clock. Fat drops that turned the street into a mirror reflecting the neon signs from the bodega and the flickering street lamp that has needed fixing since I moved here 8 years ago. Each raindrop on my window looked like a tear, and I wondered if the city was crying for all of us lonely people tucked away in these little boxes, waiting for someone to remember we existed. I waited until 8 o'clock, then 9, then 10. The pot roast grew cold on the stove. The table I'd set for 4 mocked me with its empty chairs and unused napkins. The hope I'd carried all day finally cracked like ice in spring, sharp and sudden and somehow inevitable. That night, lying in my narrow bed with the sounds of the city settling down around me, I made myself face the truth I'd been avoiding for months. My son didn't ignore my message because he was busy. He ignored it because answering would have meant disappointing me, and it was easier to let silence do the work of rejection. Morning came anyway, bringing with it the same radiator clanks and pigeon coos and chestnut smells, but everything felt different. I felt different, like something inside me had shifted in the night, like a bone had broken so cleanly I hadn't felt it snap. You have to understand, I gave everything to this family. Everything. When Michael's father left us, when Michael was only 12 years old, I worked 3 jobs to keep us in our little apartment in Sunset Park. I cleaned offices in Manhattan from midnight to 6 in the morning, then came home to get Michael ready for school, then worked at the department store from 10 to 4, folding clothes and smiling at customers and pretending my feet didn't ache like knives were stuck between my bones. Michael needed guitar lessons, so I gave up my coffee, brewing chicory instead because it was cheaper. He wanted the expensive sneakers, the ones all the kids were wearing, so I worked an extra shift cleaning the bank on weekends, scrubbing floors on my hands and knees while my son slept in warm on Saturday mornings. When he graduated high school, when he got into that community college, I was so proud I cried right there in the auditorium. "That's my boy," I whispered to the stranger sitting next to me, a woman whose own child was crossing the stage. "That's my Michael." And when the bills came, when the tuition and the books and the fees added up to more than I made in 6 months, I took out a loan against the only thing I owned, this apartment. I never told Michael about the loan, never wanted him to feel guilty, to carry that weight. I just worked more, saved less, lived on beans and rice and dreams of the day he'd graduate and get a good job and maybe, just maybe, take care of his old mother the way she'd taken care of him. College led to university. University led to graduate school. Graduate school led to debt that followed me like a shadow. But Michael was smart, brilliant even, and I told myself that every sacrifice was an investment in our future together. He'd remember what I'd done for him. He'd be grateful. He'd love me the way I loved him, completely and without reservation. When he met Anna, I was happy for him. She was pretty and educated, and came from a family with money. The kind of family that took vacations and ate at restaurants and didn't worry about the electric bill. I thought she'd be good for him, help him build the kind of life I'd never been able to give him. Anna was polite to me at first. The way people are polite to elderly relatives they don't particularly like but can't afford to offend. She smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. Asked about my health in that tone people use when they don't really want to know the answer. But Michael seemed happy, and his happiness was all that mattered to me then. The wedding was small but elegant, held at a country club in Westchester that cost more than I made in 2 years. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for my own mother's funeral 20 years before, and I smiled until my face hurt, pretending I belonged in that world of crystal glasses and 3-course meals and conversations about things I'd never experienced. Michael looked handsome in his tuxedo, standing at the altar with his shoulders straight and his chin up, ready to promise his life to someone else. I sat in the front row, watching my boy become a man, become a husband, become someone whose first loyalty would no longer be to his mother. Anna's parents paid for everything, of course. The flowers, the music, the food, the photographer who took hundreds of pictures of the happy couple, and maybe 3 of me. I understood. It was their day, their celebration, their beginning. But sitting there in my old dress with my old shoes and my old hopes, I felt like a relic from someone else's past. After the wedding, things changed gradually. So slowly, I almost didn't notice at first. Michael's visits became less frequent. His phone calls became shorter. He was building a new life with Anna, and I told myself that was natural. That was what children were supposed to do. But the distance grew like a cold draft under the door, something you don't notice until you're already shivering. When I called, Anna would answer with that polite voice, tell me Michael was busy, promise he'd call me back. He rarely did. When he did call, the conversations felt forced, like he was checking an item off his to-do list. "How are you doing, Mom?" he'd ask. But before I could answer properly, really tell him about the arthritis in my hands, or the way the stairs were getting harder to climb, or how lonely the evenings were, he'd interrupt with some story about work, or a problem with the car, or Anna's latest promotion at the law firm. I wanted to tell him I'd started talking to the pigeons on the fire escape because sometimes a whole day would pass without me hearing another human voice. I wanted to tell him about the medical bills piling up on my kitchen counter, how the insurance didn't cover as much as I'd thought it would, how I'd started skipping doses of my blood pressure medication to make the prescription last longer. But Michael was busy, successful, important. He had a life full of meetings and deadlines and responsibilities. What right did I have to burden him with the small, sad details of an old woman's daily struggles? When Leo was born, I felt hope bloom in my chest like spring after a hard winter. A grandchild, a new beginning, a chance to love someone who might love me back with the pure, uncomplicated affection children are capable of. I took the bus to the hospital as soon as Anna's mother called, my hands shaking with excitement as I counted out the exact change for the fare. Leo was perfect. 7 pounds and 2 ounces of wrinkled possibility, with tiny fists and that newborn smell that's somehow both sweet and wild. When the nurse placed him in my arms, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Necessary, important, loved. "He looks like you, Michael," I whispered, and my son smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. For a moment, we were a family again, 3 generations connected by blood and love, and the ancient miracle of new life. I bought Leo everything I could afford, and many things I couldn't. Clothes and toys and books and a savings bond I started for his college fund, putting away $10 every week, even when it meant choosing between groceries and the electric bill. I imagined teaching him to read, taking him to the zoo, watching him grow up knowing his grandmother loved him more than life itself. For the first year, they let me visit regularly. Anna would call when Leo was fussy, and I'd rush over on the subway with homemade soup and old lullabies, rocking my grandson until he slept while his parents caught up on rest. Those were good days, necessary days, days when I felt like I mattered. But as Leo grew, my visits became less welcome. Anna had opinions about everything: what Leo should eat, how he should sleep, which toys were appropriate, and which were choking hazards or developmentally inappropriate. I was old-fashioned, she said. I didn't understand modern parenting. I was confusing Leo with my outdated ideas about discipline and nutrition and the importance of fresh air. "Times have changed, Rose," she'd say, using my first name instead of calling me Mom like she had in the beginning. "We know more about child development now. We have systems, schedules, methods based on research." I wanted to tell her that I'd raised a son too, that Michael had turned out just fine despite my old-fashioned ways. But I kept quiet, nodding and smiling and pretending to agree because the alternative was not seeing Leo at all, and that possibility terrified me more than any criticism. The requests started small. Could I watch Leo for a few hours while they went to dinner? Could I pick up groceries on my way over? Could I lend them money for a security deposit on their new apartment, just until Michael's bonus came through? I said yes to everything, grateful to be needed, to have a purpose beyond counting my pills and watching the pigeons. When Leo had an ear infection and neither Michael nor Anna could take time off work, I spent 3 days at their apartment, holding my feverish grandson and singing the same lullabies I'd sung to his father 30 years before. When their car broke down and the repair bill was more than they had saved, I withdrew money from the emergency fund I'd been building for years, telling myself that their emergency was my emergency too, that families helped each other, that love meant sacrifice. When they decided to buy a house in the suburbs, a place with a yard for Leo and good schools and neighbors who looked like them and made the kind of money they wanted to make, I co-signed the mortgage because their credit wasn't quite good enough on its own. I didn't understand all the paperwork, all the legal language and interest rates and terms. I just knew my son needed help, and helping him was what mothers did. The loan officer, a young man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, asked me 3 times if I understood what I was signing, if I realized I'd be responsible for the payments if Michael and Anna couldn't make them. "He's my son," I told him, as if that explained everything. And it did, at least to me. The house was beautiful. Everything they'd dreamed of. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. A backyard where Leo could play and grow and build the kind of childhood memories I'd always wanted to give Michael but never could afford. I was happy for them. Genuinely happy. Even though the house was 2 hours away by subway and bus. Even though visiting became an all-day expedition that left me exhausted and somehow more lonely than before. At least they were happy. At least Leo had space to run and clean air to breathe, and neighbors with children his own age. But the distance wasn't just geographical. It was emotional, relational, the kind of distance that grows when people have different priorities and different values and different ideas about what family means. In their new neighborhood, I felt like an immigrant in my own family. The other grandparents drove luxury cars and wore expensive clothes and talked about European vacations and private schools and investment strategies. They had money and influence, and the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having to choose between rent and groceries. I arrived by public transportation, carrying homemade cookies in aluminum foil and clothes from the discount store. My accent, softened but never completely erased, marked me as different, other, less than. Anna's mother had a PhD and a tennis membership and opinions about organic food and screen time that made my simple offerings feel inadequate. "Maybe Leo shouldn't eat so many sweets," Anna would say when I brought my special chocolate chip cookies, the ones Michael had loved as a child. "We're trying to establish healthy eating habits." "Maybe we should limit the gifts," she'd suggest when I brought Leo a toy truck from the dollar store. "We don't want him to become materialistic or value quantity over quality." I understood. I was doing everything wrong, loving in the wrong way, giving the wrong gifts, speaking the wrong words. But I didn't know how to love differently, how to be a grandmother who enhanced their lives instead of complicating them. The visits became shorter, less frequent, more strained. I'd sit in their perfect living room with its white furniture and minimalist decoration, afraid to touch anything, afraid to speak too loudly, afraid to be myself in the presence of my own family. Leo grew from a toddler to a little boy, and I watched from the periphery as he learned to walk and talk and ride a bicycle. I saw him in photographs Anna posted on social media, images of birthday parties and school events and family vacations I wasn't invited to, wasn't even told about until after they'd happened. "We wanted to keep it small this year," Anna would explain when I asked about Leo's birthday party. "Just a few close friends from the neighborhood. You understand." I did understand. I understood that I was no longer close, no longer essential, no longer the grandmother who mattered. I was a relic from their past, an obligation to be managed, rather than a joy to be celebrated. The financial requests continued and grew larger. Michael's business wasn't doing as well as expected. Anna's law firm was downsizing. The mortgage payments were higher than they'd anticipated. Could I help with the property taxes? Could I cover Leo's summer camp fees? Could I lend them money for a new roof, a car repair, a family emergency that always seemed to emerge right when my Social Security check arrived? I said yes, because saying no felt impossible. These were my people, my only family, the reason I'd worked so hard for so many years. If I couldn't help them financially, what value did I have? What reason would they have to keep me in their lives at all? But each loan became a debt they couldn't repay. Each favor became an expectation for the next one. I was no longer their mother and grandmother. I was their banker, their safety net, their last resort when other options failed. My own bills piled up while I paid theirs. My own needs went unmet while I met theirs. I stopped going to the doctor for my regular checkups because I'd given them the money I'd saved for medical expenses. I kept the heat low in winter to save on utilities, wearing sweaters and blankets to stay warm while they enjoyed their climate-controlled comfort. I told myself this was temporary, that things would improve, that they'd remember my sacrifices and find a way to pay me back. If not in money, then in love, in visits, in the kind of relationship I'd always dreamed of having with my adult son and his family. But temporary stretched into months, then years. My health declined as I skipped medications and delayed treatments. My isolation deepened as I became too embarrassed to see friends, too ashamed to admit how completely I'd been consumed by my family's needs, while my own life slowly disappeared. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in February, one of those bitter Brooklyn days when the wind cuts through you like a blade and the sky is the color of old pewter. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting through bills and wondering how I'd make it through the month, when my phone rang. It was Anna, her voice tight with stress and urgency. Michael had been arrested, she said. White-collar crime, embezzlement, something complex involving his company's clients and missing money and federal investigators. She needed bail money, needed it immediately, needed more than I had, but somehow expected me to find it anyway. This is a mistake, she kept saying. Michael would never do anything illegal. You know him, Rose. You know he's a good person. We just need enough money to get him out until we can clear this up. The bail was set at $50,000. $50,000 I didn't have, couldn't borrow, couldn't produce no matter how much Anna believed I should be able to help. I'd given them everything already. My savings, my retirement fund, my emergency money, my dignity, my future. I don't have it, I whispered into the phone, the words feeling like glass in my throat. The silence that followed was long and heavy, filled with Anna's disbelief and my shame, and the awful truth that I'd finally reached the bottom of my capacity to rescue them. What do you mean you don't have it? Anna's voice rose to a pitch I'd never heard before, sharp with panic and accusation. You always have money when we need it. You can get a loan, sell something, ask someone for help. I looked around my tiny apartment, at the secondhand furniture and faded photographs and empty spaces where I'd already sold everything of value to fund their dreams. There was nothing left to sell, no one left to ask, no magic solution to produce money that simply didn't exist. I've given you everything, I said, quietly but clearly. I have nothing left. Anna hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me alone with the silence and the terrible understanding that I'd failed them when they needed me most. Not by choice, not from lack of love, but because I'd already sacrificed everything I had to give. Michael spent 3 days in jail before Anna's parents posted bail. 3 days when neither of them called me, contacted me, acknowledged that I existed or cared what happened to my son. I read about it in the newspaper, seeing his name in print next to words like alleged and fraudulent and investigation. The shame was suffocating. I'd lived in this neighborhood for 8 years, had built fragile friendships with shopkeepers and bus drivers and other elderly people who knew me as Leo's grandmother, Michael's mother, someone who mattered to someone who mattered. Now I was the mother of a suspected criminal, the grandmother whose son's photograph appeared on the evening news being led away in handcuffs. Mrs. Chen next door stopped greeting me in the hallway. The man at the corner store avoided eye contact when I bought my groceries. The children playing in the courtyard whispered and pointed when I passed. When Michael was released, when the lawyers began building his defense, when Anna started making plans for how they'd handle the media attention and the social stigma and the legal fees that would drain whatever resources they had left, I waited for someone to call me, to include me, to remember that I was part of this family too. The call came, but not the way I'd expected. "Mom, we need you to testify at the preliminary hearing," Michael said, his voice flat and mechanical, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. "Testify to what?" "Character witness. Tell the judge what kind of person I am, how I was raised, why this is all a misunderstanding. Anna's parents will be there too, and some people from the neighborhood, colleagues from work." I said yes. Of course I said yes. This was my chance to help, to be useful, to show the world that my son was more than his worst moment, more than whatever mistakes he might have made in the desperate pursuit of success and security. I spent weeks preparing, remembering stories from Michael's childhood, examples of his kindness and honesty and integrity. I practiced in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to find the words that would convince a judge that the man who'd been arrested wasn't the real Michael, wasn't the son I'd raised and loved and sacrificed everything to support. The courthouse was intimidating, All marble columns and echoing footsteps and people in expensive suits who looked like they belonged in a world I'd never been invited to enter. I wore my best dress, the same navy blue one I'd worn to Michael's wedding, and I carried a small purse with tissues and throat lozenges and a photograph of baby Leo to remind me why I was there. Michael's lawyer was younger than my son, confident in the way that comes from money and education and never having to doubt whether you belong in the room you're standing in. He explained my role, told me what questions I'd be asked, reminded me to speak clearly and honestly, and remember that everything I said would be recorded and evaluated and potentially used to determine my son's future. I sat in the gallery for hours, watching other witnesses testify, learning the rhythms and procedures of a system I'd never had to navigate before. Anna's mother spoke eloquently about Michael's character and work ethic. His former boss praised his dedication and attention to detail. A neighbor described him as quiet and responsible and devoted to his family. Then it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand on shaking legs, my hand trembling as I placed it on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The judge looked down at me with kind but tired eyes. A woman about my daughter-in-law's age who'd probably heard 1,000 mothers testify about their son's innocence. Michael's lawyer asked the questions we'd rehearsed. How had I raised Michael? What kind of values had I tried to instill? What evidence had I seen of his honesty and integrity throughout his life? I answered as best I could, telling stories about the boy who'd brought me dandelions and called them flowers, who'd worked part-time jobs to help with expenses, who'd never missed a day of school or gotten in trouble with the police or given me any reason to doubt his fundamental goodness. But as I spoke, something strange began to happen. The stories sounded hollow, even to me. Not because they weren't true, but because they were incomplete, edited versions of a more complex reality. Yes, Michael had been a good student, but he'd also been entitled, expecting me to solve his problems and meet his needs without question or complaint. Yes, he'd worked part-time jobs, but he'd also spent money freely, assuming I'd cover any shortfalls. Yes, he'd stayed out of trouble, but he'd also learned early that his mother would sacrifice anything to protect him from consequences. Had I raised him to be honest? Or had I raised him to believe that rules applied to other people? Had I taught him integrity? Or had I shown him that love meant never having to face the full weight of your choices? The prosecutor's cross-examination was gentle but relentless. Had I co-signed loans for my son? Yes. Had I given him money when he claimed to be in financial trouble? Yes. Had I ever wondered where that money was really going? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. I looked at Michael, sitting at the defendant's table in his expensive suit and silk tie, and for the first time in 40 years, I really saw him. Not the baby I'd rocked to sleep, or the child I'd protected, or the dream of who I'd hoped he'd become, but the man he actually was. A man who'd learned to charm and manipulate and take without giving back. A man who'd married into money and lived beyond his means, and convinced himself that borrowing from clients was just a temporary solution to a cash flow problem. A man who'd grown up believing that his mother's love was infinite and unconditional and inexhaustible, no matter what he did or how little he gave in return. The prosecutor asked one final question, the one that shattered what was left of my carefully constructed denial. Mrs. Rodriguez, in your opinion, is your son capable of taking money that doesn't belong to him? The courtroom fell silent. Michael's lawyer looked alarmed. Anna stared at me with barely concealed panic. My son's face had gone pale, gray as the February sky outside. But sitting there in that witness stand, under oath to tell the truth, with my hand still tingling from touching the Bible, I found I couldn't lie anymore. Not to the judge, not to the jury, not to myself. I thought about all the money I'd given him over the years, all the loans he'd never repaid, all the favors I'd granted without question. I thought about the mortgage I'd co-signed for a house I was never really welcome in, the credit cards I'd opened in my name to pay for his family's expenses, the retirement funds I'd liquidated to support their lifestyle. Had he stolen from me? Had he taken what wasn't his, spent money he hadn't earned, built his life on my sacrifices without acknowledging the cost? Mrs. Rodriguez? The prosecutor prompted gently. I looked at my son one more time, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time in his life, the little boy who'd never learned to hear no. the teenager who'd expected me to solve every problem, the man who'd built his marriage and his career and his entire adult identity on the foundation of his mother's infinite willingness to be used. "Yes," I whispered, and then louder, because truth deserves to be heard. "Yes, I believe he is." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Michael's face went from pale to white, his mouth opening and closing like he was drowning in air. Anna gasped audibly, her mother's hand flying to her throat. The defense attorney jumped to his feet, objecting to something, but I couldn't hear what over the ringing in my ears. In that moment, sitting on that witness stand in that marble courthouse, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Free. The weight of protecting him, enabling him, making excuses for him, finally lifted from my shoulders like a boulder I'd been carrying so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. After the hearing, after the reporters and the lawyers and the court officials had done their business, I found myself standing on the courthouse steps with my family scattered around me like the aftermath of an explosion. Michael wouldn't look at me. Anna kept shaking her head and muttering under her breath. Leo, who'd been kept home from school to avoid the media attention, wasn't there at all. "How could you?" Anna finally spoke, her voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "How could you betray your own son like that? How could you destroy your own family?" I looked at her, this woman I'd tried so hard to please, whose approval I'd chased for 10 years, and I realized I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not regret. Just a vast, clean emptiness where years of anxiety and guilt and desperate hope had lived. "I didn't destroy our family," I said quietly. "I just stopped pretending it existed." That night, alone in my apartment with the radiator clanking and the pigeons cooing and the familiar sounds of Brooklyn settling into darkness around me, I made myself tea and sat at my kitchen table with a pen and paper. I wrote a letter to Michael and Anna, explaining everything I'd never been brave enough to say, how lonely I'd been, how used I'd felt, how desperately I'd wanted to matter to them in some way beyond my ability to solve their financial problems. I wrote about the grandmother I'd wanted to be to Leo, the relationship I'd dreamed of having with my daughter-in-law, the family dinners and holiday celebrations and ordinary Tuesday afternoons I'd imagined sharing with the people I loved most. I wrote about the woman I'd been before I became their solution to every crisis, the dreams I'd deferred, and the friendships I'd neglected, and the dozen small joys I'd given up to make room for their needs. And then, I wrote about the woman I wanted to become in whatever years I had left. Someone who said no when no was the honest answer. Someone who gave love freely but didn't buy it with money or favors or endless self-sacrifice. Someone who mattered to herself, even if she didn't matter to anyone else. I sealed the letter in an envelope, addressed it carefully, and set it on the table where I'd see it first thing in the morning. Then I went to bed and slept more soundly than I had in years. The next morning brought consequences, as truth always does. My phone rang before I'd finished my coffee, Anna's voice sharp with panic and accusation. "The bail bondsman called," she said without preamble. "Michael violated the terms of his release by leaving the state. They want the full bail amount immediately, or they're putting a lien on the house." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Sorry that they were in trouble, sorry that Leo would be affected, sorry that things had reached this point, but not sorry enough to fix it. Not anymore. "Rose, you have to help us. You're the only one who can. You have equity in your apartment. You could get a second mortgage. You could—" "No," I interrupted gently. "I can't." The silence stretched between us, filled with Anna's disbelief and my newfound certainty. "You can't, or you won't?" she demanded. "Both," I said, and it felt like the most honest thing I'd said in years. Anna hung up without saying goodbye, and I knew it would be the last time we'd speak as family members, as people who cared about each other's well-being and shared responsibility for each other's happiness. That afternoon, I walked to the corner and mailed the letter I'd written the night before. Then I kept walking, further than I'd walked in years, through neighborhoods I'd forgotten existed, past shops and restaurants and parks where other people were living their lives without apology or explanation. I found myself at the Brooklyn Bridge, standing among tourists and commuters and other wanderers, looking across the water at Manhattan's glittering skyline. The city looked different from this angle, full of possibilities I'd never considered, dreams I'd never dared to dream. For 40 years, I'd defined myself as Michael's mother, Leo's grandmother, Anna's mother-in-law. But standing there on that bridge with the wind in my hair and the sun on my face, I remembered that I was also Rose Rodriguez, a woman with her own story to tell, her own life to live, her own choices to make. I thought about Mrs. Gonzalez, my neighbor who'd brought me soup when I was sick and listened to my stories about the old country and never asked for anything in return. I thought about the community center where I'd gotten legal advice, where other senior citizens gathered for exercise classes and book clubs and social events I'd never attended because I was too busy being available for my family's emergencies. I thought about the art supplies gathering dust in my closet, the paints and brushes I'd bought years ago with the intention of taking up watercolors again, the way I had as a young woman before marriage and motherhood consumed every creative impulse. Walking home in the golden afternoon light, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, curiosity about my own future. What would I do with the time I'd been spending worrying about Michael? How would I fill the space that had been occupied by Anna's disapproval and Leo's enforced distance? Who might I become if I stopped trying to be indispensable to people who didn't want me around? The answers came slowly, over the following weeks and months, as winter gave way to spring and the bare trees outside my window began to show green. Small changes first, then larger ones, like ripples spreading outward from a stone dropped into still water. I started saying no to things I didn't want to do, and yes to things that interested me. When the community center offered a beginning Spanish class for seniors, I signed up, even though I'd spoken the language fluently as a child. It felt good to use those muscles again, to remember the woman I'd been before English became my primary language and assimilation, my primary goal. I joined the book club that met every Thursday afternoon in the center's main room, a group of 8 women and 2 men who read everything from mystery novels to poetry collections and debated the endings with surprising passion. For the first time in years, I had opinions about something other than my family's problems. I bought new paints, better brushes, a small easel that fit perfectly by my living room window. My first attempts were clumsy, embarrassing. The hands that had once created delicate watercolor flowers now stiff and uncertain. But art, like muscle memory, came back gradually, and soon I was painting again, not well but with joy, which turned out to be more important. Mrs. Gonzalez noticed the changes, commented on the light in my eyes and the steadiness in my voice. We began taking walks together in the evenings, 2 old women exploring our neighborhood like tourists in our own lives, discovering stores we'd never entered and parks we'd never visited. "You seem different," she said one evening as we sat on a bench watching children play in the small playground near our building. "Happier, more yourself." I considered her words, thinking about the woman I'd been 6 months earlier, anxious and depleted and desperate for scraps of attention from people who saw me as a burden. That woman felt like someone I'd known long ago, someone I'd outgrown like clothes that no longer fit. "I stopped trying to be someone else," I said finally. "Someone more useful, more necessary, more acceptable. It's exhausting, pretending to be different than you are." Mrs. Gonzalez nodded wisely. "My daughter used to tell me I was too loud, too emotional, too much. So I tried to be quieter, calmer, less. But less is not better. Less is just less." We sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the buildings, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me why I'd always loved this neighborhood, this city, this life I'd built for myself before I gave it all away in the name of family duty. Summer brought news of Michael's trial and conviction. 3 years in federal prison for embezzlement, restitution ordered but unlikely to be paid, his professional reputation destroyed, and his marriage hanging by threads that grew thinner each day. I felt sad for him, for the boy he'd been and the man he might have become if I'd loved him differently, taught him better, set boundaries that protected us both. But I didn't feel responsible. Not anymore. His choices were his own, just as mine were mine. Anna filed for divorce while Michael served his sentence, taking Leo and moving back to her parents' house in Westchester. She didn't tell me about any of this directly. I learned it from court documents that became public record, from newspaper articles that followed the case to its conclusion. I thought about Leo often, wondered if he missed his father, if he understood why his grandmother had disappeared from his life, if he'd ever want to know my side of the story when he was old enough to ask the right questions. But I didn't try to contact him, didn't push for visitation rights, or demand to be included in decisions about his future. He had plenty of adults in his life, and I had learned the difference between loving someone and needing to be needed by them. Instead, I focused on building the life I wanted to live, the one I'd been too afraid to imagine when all my energy was devoted to fixing other people's problems. I volunteered at the literacy center, teaching English to new immigrants who reminded me of the young woman I'd been 40 years earlier. Their gratitude was genuine, and their progress was measurable, and their success didn't depend on my ability to sacrifice myself for their benefit. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during the years when family crises consumed all my time and attention. We met for coffee, went to movies, shared stories about grandchildren and health scares, and the strange freedom that comes with growing older and caring less about what other people think. I traveled, just small trips at first, day excursions to museums and historic sites I'd always meant to visit. Then longer journeys, a weekend in Boston, a week in Florida visiting my cousin Maria, whom I hadn't seen since her wedding 30 years before. Each trip taught me something new about my own capacity for independence, my ability to navigate the world alone and actually enjoy the solitude. I'd spent so many years fearing abandonment that I'd forgotten how peaceful it could be to answer to no one, to change plans without consulting anyone, to spend money on myself without guilt or justification. The apartment gradually transformed as I filled it with things I liked, rather than things I thought other people would approve of. Bright paintings covered the walls, plants crowded the windowsills, books stacked on every surface. It looked lived in now, loved, like the home of someone who mattered to herself. One autumn afternoon, almost 2 years after the trial, I was reading in my favorite chair by the window when my phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, but something made me answer. Grandma Rose? The voice was young, uncertain, beloved. Leo. My hand tightened on the phone, my heart racing with surprise and hope, and the careful caution that comes from loving someone who's been taught not to love you back. Yes, sweetheart, it's me. I got your address from the phone book, he said, which made me smile because I hadn't realized children his age knew phone books existed. I wanted to talk to you. About Dad, about the trial, about everything. We talked for an hour, my grandson and me, bridging 2 years of silence with the tentative honesty that comes from both sides wanting the same thing for the first time in their relationship. Leo had questions I couldn't answer, and pain I couldn't heal. But I could listen, really listen, without trying to fix or explain or protect anyone from the complicated truth of what our family had become. Mom says you chose Dad's victims over your own family, Leo said toward the end of our conversation. She says you betrayed us when we needed you most. I thought carefully before answering, wanting to be honest without burdening him with more adult complexity than he could handle. I chose the truth, I said finally. Sometimes the truth hurts people we love, but lies hurt them more, even when we tell the lies to protect them. Do you miss us? He asked, and my heart broke a little at the vulnerability in his voice. Every day, I admitted, but I don't miss the way things were. I miss the way I always hoped they could be. We made plans to meet, cautiously, in a neutral place where Leo could leave if he felt uncomfortable, and I could maintain the boundaries I'd learned to set. It wasn't a reunion or a reconciliation, just two people who shared blood and history trying to figure out what, if anything, they meant to each other now. That night I couldn't sleep, not from anxiety, but from a strange, effervescent excitement I hadn't felt in years. Whatever happened with Leo, however our relationship developed or failed to develop, I was proud of the woman who'd answered his call. Not the desperate grandmother who would have promised him anything, given him anything, sacrificed anything to keep him in her life, but someone steadier, calmer, more genuine, someone who could love him without needing him, who could offer him truth instead of just comfort, who could be his grandmother without losing herself in the role. I got up and made tea, standing by the window in my robe and slippers, watching the early morning light paint Brooklyn's skyline in shades of silver and gold. The city was waking up around me, full of people starting new days, making new choices, writing new chapters in the stories of their lives. I'd spent 78 years believing that love meant sacrifice, that caring meant suffering, that family meant enduring whatever treatment people chose to give you because blood was thicker than dignity. But standing there in my own home, surrounded by evidence of my own interests and personality and worth, I finally understood what I'd been missing all those years. Love that requires you to disappear isn't love at all. It's consumption, transaction, a form of slow suicide disguised as virtue. Real love, the kind worth having, sees you clearly and values you completely, and would never ask you to be less than yourself to make someone else comfortable. I'd never had that kind of love from my family, might never have it from anyone, but I could give it to myself, and that turned out to be enough, more than enough. It was everything. 3 months later, Leo and I met at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden on a crisp December afternoon when the greenhouse provided warmth, and the winter light made everything look clean and possible. He was taller than I'd expected, 13 now, and growing into the kind of young man who might someday understand the complexity of family loyalty and personal integrity without having to choose between them. We walked among the tropical plants, talking about school and friends and his plans for high school. We talked about his father, carefully and briefly, acknowledging the pain without wallowing in it. We talked about his mother and her new job and the apartment they'd moved to after selling the house. And we talked about me, the grandmother he was just beginning to know, my art classes and book club and volunteer work, my plans to visit Puerto Rico in the spring, to see the places my parents had described in stories, but I'd never experienced myself. "You seem different than I remember," Leo said as we sat on a bench surrounded by orchids and ferns and the humid sweetness of growth and renewal. "I am different," I agreed. "I learned to like myself. It changes everything else." He considered this with the seriousness children bring to ideas they're encountering for the first time. "Mom says self-care is selfish," he said finally. I smiled, thinking of all the ways Anna had been wrong about so many things, all the lessons she'd learned from her own parents about putting other people's needs first, regardless of the cost to yourself. "Maybe," I said, "but I spent 76 years taking care of everyone except myself, and it didn't make any of us happy. I'm trying something different now." "Is it working?" I looked around the greenhouse at the blooming flowers and thriving plants, at the careful balance of light and water and nutrients that kept everything growing. I thought about my own life, the careful balance I'd been learning to maintain between solitude and connection, giving and receiving, love and boundaries. "Yes," I said, "I think it is." We parted that day with a tentative plan to meet again in a few weeks, to continue building whatever relationship was possible between us now. Not the one I'd dreamed of when he was born, not the one he'd been taught to expect, but something honest and respectful and potentially lasting. I rode the subway home through the decorated city, past shop windows full of holiday displays and families loaded down with packages, and the million small celebrations that mark the end of one year and the beginning of another. That night, I called Mrs. Gonzalez and invited her for dinner, cooking enough food for 4 people because I'd never learned to scale down my portions and didn't want to start now. We ate and laughed and planned our New Year's resolution to take a pottery class at the community center, to try something neither of us had ever done before. Later, after she'd gone home and I'd cleaned the dishes and turned off most of the lights, I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of tea and a new book, and the deep satisfaction that comes from a life lived on your own terms. Outside my window, Brooklyn hummed with its usual energy. 8 million people pursuing 8 million different versions of happiness, success, love, fulfillment. Some of them had families who cherished them, and some had families who disappointed them, and some, like me, had learned to build lives that didn't depend entirely on other people's capacity for appreciation. I thought about Michael, serving his sentence and hopefully learning something from the consequences he'd finally been forced to face. I thought about Anna, raising Leo alone and maybe beginning to understand the weight of responsibility I'd carried for so many years. I thought about Leo, growing up in a complex world with divorced parents and a convicted father and a grandmother who loved him enough to tell the truth instead of just telling him what he wanted to hear. And I thought about me, The woman I'd become in the space between losing my old family and creating my new life. Someone braver than I'd expected, more resilient than I'd known, capable of happiness that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or presence or love. The clock on my mantle chimed 10 times, marking the end of another day in what had turned out to be an extraordinary year. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything quiet and gradual and revolutionary had been happening all along. I'd learned to say no without apologizing. I'd discovered interests I'd forgotten I had. I'd made friends who liked me for who I was rather than what I could provide. I'd created a home that reflected my personality instead of someone else's expectations. Most importantly, I'd stopped waiting for my life to begin when other people decided I was worthy of love and attention. I'd begun it myself, messy and imperfect, and entirely my own. As I prepared for bed that night, going through the small rituals that mark the transition from day to dreams, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had silver hair and laugh lines, and the sort of quiet confidence that comes from surviving your own transformation. She looked like someone I'd want to be friends with, someone with stories worth hearing and wisdom worth sharing, and a future worth anticipating. She looked like someone who mattered, to herself, if to nobody else. And that, I realized, had been the point all along. Now, as I sit here telling you this story, 3 years have passed since that day in the courtroom when I chose truth over comfortable lies. 3 years of learning who I am when I'm not trying to be indispensable to people who don't want me around. Leo visits every few weeks now. We have lunch, go to museums, talk about books and movies and the ordinary details of our separate lives. He's 15 now, old enough to understand that families are complicated and love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. He told me recently that his mother has started dating someone new, a man who makes her laugh and doesn't need her to solve his financial problems. I was happy to hear it, genuinely happy, because Anna deserves joy and Leo deserves to see what healthy relationships look like. Michael was released last spring and moved back to Brooklyn, not far from me, but far enough. We don't speak often, but when we do, the conversations are polite, careful, honest in a way they never were before. He's working construction now, manual labor that pays daily wages and requires him to show up every morning if he wants to eat every night. It's humbling work for someone who once wore suits and managed other people's money, but humility was something he needed to learn. I'm proud of him for doing the hard work of rebuilding his life without expecting anyone else to make it easy for him. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd learned to set boundaries earlier. If I'd taught him as a child that love doesn't mean taking everything someone is willing to give, but regret is a luxury I can't afford, not at my age, not with so much living still to do. I'm planning a trip to Ireland next summer, to trace my father's family history and see the countryside he described in stories I thought I'd forgotten. Mrs. Gonzalez is coming with me. We've become expert travelers together, 2 old women who refuse to let age or solitude limit our adventures. My apartment is full of art now, paintings I've created and photographs from places I've visited, and plants that thrive under my careful attention. It looks like the home of someone who expects to stay, who's invested in her own comfort and happiness. I volunteer 3 days a week at the Literacy Center and attend book club every Thursday, and paint by the window every morning while I drink my coffee and watch Brooklyn wake up around me. It's a quiet life, but it's mine. Every choice and priority and small daily pleasure earned through the difficult work of learning to value myself. The loneliness I feared for so many years never materialized the way I expected. Yes, I spend more time alone now than I did when I was constantly available to solve other people's crises. But solitude isn't the same as loneliness, just as being used isn't the same as being loved. I have friends who enjoy my company without needing my money. I have interests that engage my mind without depleting my resources. I have a purpose that comes from contributing to something larger than myself, without sacrificing everything I am for someone else's benefit. And I have peace, the deep peace that comes from alignment between your values and your choices, your hopes and your actions, your public face and your private truth. It wasn't easy getting here. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd made the right choices, mornings when I questioned whether truth was worth the cost of the relationships it had ended. But every time I doubted myself, I remembered that courtroom, That moment when I had to choose between protecting my son from consequences and protecting myself from complicity. I remembered the lightness I felt when I finally stopped lying, to him and about him, and most importantly to myself. The truth didn't destroy my family. The truth revealed that what I'd been calling family was actually something else entirely. A system of mutual exploitation disguised as love, a transaction disguised as a relationship. Real families, healthy families, don't require anyone to disappear in order to belong. They don't demand silence in the face of harm or loyalty that ignores morality. They don't confuse enabling with caring or guilt with affection. I know this now because I've learned what real relationships feel like, what genuine care looks like when it flows in both directions. It's nothing like what I had with Michael and Anna, nothing like the desperate, one-sided devotion I thought was love, but was actually just fear of abandonment. Learning this has been the gift of my later years, the unexpected treasure hidden in what looked like loss and betrayal and family collapse. I lost people I thought I loved, but I found myself. I lost relationships that were slowly killing me, but I gained a life that feels worth living. If you're listening to this story and recognizing something familiar, if you're seeing your own family patterns reflected in mine, I want you to know it's not too late to choose differently. It's never too late to stop apologizing for taking up space, stop buying love with money or favors or endless self-sacrifice. You matter. Not because of what you can provide for others, but because you exist. Because you have value that doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition or appreciation. You deserve relationships that see and celebrate who you are, not just who you're willing to become for someone else's comfort. It's scary, choosing yourself. It feels selfish and wrong and dangerous, because we've been taught that our worth comes from our usefulness to others. But I'm here to tell you that the fear passes. The guilt fades. The loneliness you're afraid of is nothing compared to the loneliness of being invisible in your own life. 3 years ago, I was a woman who defined herself by other people's needs, other people's approval, other people's love. I lived in constant anxiety, always afraid of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, being insufficient in ways that would justify my abandonment. Today, I'm a woman who knows her own mind, speaks her own truth, and creates her own joy. I'm not perfect, not always happy, not immune to sadness or loss or the ordinary difficulties that come with being human and aging and mortal. But I'm free in a way I never was before, free to make choices based on my own values rather than other people's expectations, free to love without losing myself, free to be disappointing to people who were never really looking at me anyway. Sometimes I think about the woman I might have become if I'd started this journey earlier, if I'd learned in my 40s or 50s that love doesn't require self-erasure. But I try not to dwell on what-ifs. Every age has its gifts, and the gift of turning 78 was finally being tired enough of my old patterns to try something completely different. There's a freedom that comes with age, a permission to stop caring quite so much about what other people think. When you realize that you have more years behind you than ahead of you, suddenly the opinions of people who don't actually care about your well-being matter less than they used to. I started small, learning to say no to requests that felt overwhelming or manipulative. "I can't help with that" became a sentence I could say without following it with apologies or long explanations about why. Just, "I can't." Or better yet, "I won't." The first few times felt terrifying. Like I was risking everything, but nothing terrible happened. The world didn't end. People adapted to my unavailability, found other solutions to their problems, or decided their problems weren't as urgent as they'd initially claimed. I learned that many of the emergencies I'd been asked to solve over the years weren't actually emergencies at all. They were inconveniences, or consequences someone didn't want to face, or simple failures of planning that got elevated to crisis status because someone knew I'd always say yes. When I stopped automatically saying yes, some of those crises resolved themselves. Others revealed their true nature as ongoing patterns of poor decision-making that no amount of my help would ever permanently fix. The hardest part wasn't learning to say no. The hardest part was learning to tolerate the anger and disappointment of people who'd grown accustomed to my compliance. When you change the rules of a relationship, even rules that were slowly destroying you, The other person doesn't usually thank you for the growth opportunity. Michael's initial reaction to my testimony was rage, pure and consuming. He called me names I won't repeat, accused me of ruining his life, destroying his family, betraying the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him. He was right about the sacrifice. He was wrong about who owed what to whom. For a while, I felt guilty about his anger. This was my son, my child, the person I'd loved longer and more consistently than anyone else in the world. Seeing him in pain, knowing I'd contributed to that pain, activated every maternal instinct I'd developed over 40 years of putting his needs first. But then I remembered something my therapist had told me during one of our sessions. Yes, I'd started seeing a therapist, finally, at 76 years old. Mrs. Gonzalez had recommended her, a woman named Dr. Sarah Martinez, who specialized in family dynamics and had the particular gift of helping people untangle love from obligation. "Rose," she'd said during one of our early sessions, "you've spent your entire adult life managing your son's emotions. When he was sad, you tried to make him happy. When he was angry, you tried to appease him. When he was scared, you tried to remove whatever frightened him. But emotions aren't problems to be solved. They're information to be processed. By constantly rescuing him from uncomfortable feelings, you prevented him from developing the skills to handle those feelings himself." She was right, of course. Michael had never learned to self-soothe, to problem-solve independently, to accept responsibility for the natural consequences of his choices. Why would he, when his mother had spent 40 years ensuring he never had to? Dr. Martinez helped me understand that enabling isn't the same as loving, even though our culture often confuses the two. Especially when it comes to mothers and adult children, there's an expectation that maternal love should be infinite, unconditional, endlessly giving. But Dr. Martinez helped me see that true love sometimes looks like letting people struggle with problems they're capable of solving themselves. "Think about Leo," she'd said. "If he comes to you when he's 16 and asks you to write his college essays because he's too stressed to do it himself, what would be the loving response? To write the essays and spare him the stress? Or to help him develop strategies for managing stress while he writes his own essays?" The answer was obvious when applied to Leo, less obvious when applied to Michael, but the principle was the same. Love that consistently rescues people from the consequences of their choices eventually becomes love that prevents people from growing, learning, developing resilience. I'd thought I was being loving when I co-signed Michael's mortgage, when I lent him money for emergencies that kept arising, when I made excuses for his behavior to Anna and Leo and anyone else who questioned his character. But what I was actually being was afraid. Afraid he'd fail, afraid he'd suffer, afraid he'd stop needing me. The fear of not being needed had driven most of my parenting decisions, most of my relationship choices, most of my financial sacrifices. I'd confused being needed with being loved, and that confusion had shaped 40 years of family dynamics that ultimately served no one. When Michael was finally forced to face the consequences of his embezzlement without my intervention, something interesting happened. Initially, yes, he was angry and resentful, and convinced that his problems were everyone's fault but his own. But gradually, slowly, he began to take responsibility in ways he never had before. Prison, for all its obvious drawbacks, gave him time to think without distractions. No job to consume his days, no family demands to manage, no immediate crises to solve, just time, silence, and the unavoidable reality of where his choices had led him. The first letter he sent me from prison was full of accusations and self-pity. The second was slightly less so. By the fourth or fifth letter, he was beginning to acknowledge the pattern of financial irresponsibility that had characterized his adult life. The way he'd rationalized taking money that didn't belong to him, the impact his choices had had on his wife and son. It wasn't a complete transformation. People don't fundamentally change their character at 42 years old because they spend 3 years in federal prison. But it was a beginning, a first step toward the kind of self-awareness that might eventually lead to different choices. I wrote back carefully, honestly, without the sugarcoating I'd used in our conversations for years. I told him I loved him, but disagreed with many of his choices. I told him I was proud when he took responsibility, and disappointed when he made excuses. I told him I hoped he'd use his time in prison to develop better strategies for managing money, relationships, and the ordinary stresses of adult life. Most importantly, I told him I wouldn't be financing his life after his release. He'd need to find work, secure his own housing, rebuild his credit and his reputation through his own efforts. I'd cheer for his successes and offer emotional support during difficult times, but I wouldn't solve his problems for him anymore. His response to that letter was angry again, full of wounded incredulity that his own mother would abandon him when he needed her most. But underneath the anger, I sensed something else. Relief, maybe. Or hope. The relief of finally knowing where the boundaries were. The hope that comes from realizing you might be stronger than you thought you were. When he was released, Michael didn't ask me for money, didn't expect me to solve his housing crisis or co-sign loans for a car. He found his own place, a studio apartment in Queens that he could afford on construction wages. He bought a used bicycle for transportation and learned to cook simple meals on a hot plate. The first time he visited my apartment after his release, we sat awkwardly at my kitchen table, two people who'd known each other for 42 years and somehow felt like strangers. He looked older, thinner, more careful in his movements and words. Prison had aged him, but it had also given him a gravity he'd never possessed before. "I keep waiting for you to offer to help," he said finally, when the small talk had exhausted itself. "I know," I replied. "Are you disappointed that I'm not?" He considered this for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it might contain answers to questions he was just learning to ask. "No," he said eventually. "Not disappointed. Scared, maybe. But also, I think I'm proud of myself for figuring things out on my own. I didn't think I could." That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship, not a return to the old patterns of dependence and rescue, but the beginning of something new, something more honest, more respectful of each other's autonomy, more sustainable over the long term. We began having monthly dinners, sometimes at my apartment, sometimes at restaurants Michael chose and paid for with his own money. He'd tell me about his job, the co-workers he was getting to know, the small challenges of rebuilding a life from nothing. I'd tell him about my art classes, my volunteer work, the books I was reading, and the places I was planning to visit. These weren't the conversations we'd had before, full of his problems and my solutions. These were the conversations of two adults who cared about each other, but weren't responsible for each other's happiness or success. It took some getting used to, but it felt more genuine than anything we'd shared in decades. Leo's re-entry into my life happened more gradually, with the careful curiosity of a teenager trying to understand adults who'd disappointed him. Our first few meetings were stilted, formal, both of us unsure how to navigate the space between who we'd been to each other and who we might become. But Leo was young enough to adapt, generous enough to forgive, curious enough to want to understand the grandmother who'd chosen truth over family loyalty in a public courtroom. He asked hard questions about my testimony, about my relationship with his father, about why I'd stopped being available for family emergencies. I answered as honestly as I could without burdening him with more adult complexity than a teenager should have to carry. I explained that love sometimes means disappointing people in the short term to help them in the long term. I talked about the difference between helping someone and enabling them, between being supportive and being used. Most importantly, I showed him what it looked like to live as a person rather than just as someone's grandmother, mother, or caregiver. I let him see my art, my interests, my friendships with people who had nothing to do with our family. I let him understand that I had value and purpose beyond my relationships with the people I'd given birth to and raised. Leo soaked up these lessons in the way that teenagers do, through observation more than instruction. He saw that I could be happy without being needed, fulfilled without being indispensable, loved without sacrificing everything I was for someone else's comfort. He also saw the consequences of his father's choices played out in real time, without a grandmother rushing in to cushion every blow or solve every problem. When Michael struggled with loneliness in his studio apartment, Leo witnessed his father learning to cope with solitude instead of expecting someone else to provide constant companionship. When Michael's bicycle broke down and he couldn't afford immediate repairs, Leo watched his father walk to work for a week while he saved money for parts, instead of calling someone to bail him out of a temporary inconvenience. These weren't comfortable situations for any of us to watch, but they were educational. Leo learned that adults are responsible for solving their own problems, that struggling with challenges is a normal part of life, that asking for help is different from expecting others to take responsibility for circumstances you've created yourself. As Leo grew older and our relationship deepened, he began to understand the impossible position I'd been placed in during his father's trial. The choice between protecting a family member from consequences and protecting victims from ongoing harm. The choice between loyalty and honesty, between short-term peace and long-term integrity. "I used to think you betrayed Dad," he told me during one of our museum visits, as we stood in front of a painting that depicted a woman alone in a garden, surrounded by flowers she'd clearly tended herself. "But now I think maybe you saved him. From himself, I mean." I didn't agree or disagree with his assessment. Truth doesn't need defense. It just needs to be spoken and allowed to do its work over time. Michael's salvation, if it came at all, would come from his own choices, his own efforts, his own willingness to face reality instead of running from it. But I was proud of Leo for being able to hold the complexity of the situation, to see that sometimes love looks like refusing to participate in someone else's self-destruction, even when that refusal costs you relationships you'd hope to preserve. The changes in my own life continued to unfold in ways I couldn't have predicted when I first started saying no to requests that felt manipulative or overwhelming. The art classes led to exhibitions at the community center, small displays of watercolor paintings that sold for modest amounts and gave me a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in decades. The literacy center work introduced me to people whose gratitude was genuine rather than transactional, who appreciated my help without expecting me to solve problems I wasn't qualified to handle. I taught English to a woman from Bangladesh who wanted to communicate better with her grandson's teachers. I worked with a man from El Salvador who needed to pass a citizenship test to keep his job at the post office. These interactions reminded me why I'd originally loved helping people, back before helping became synonymous with being used. There's joy in teaching someone a skill they need, in watching their confidence grow as their competence develops, in celebrating successes that belong entirely to their own efforts. My friendship with Mrs. Gonzalez deepened into something I'd never experienced before, a relationship between equals, based on mutual enjoyment rather than mutual dependence. We traveled together, read books together, supported each other through minor health scares and major life transitions. When Mrs. Gonzalez's daughter criticized her for wasting money on trips to Florida and Ireland, I watched my friend respond with the kind of calm certainty I was still learning to cultivate. "Mita," she said to her daughter, "I worked for 50 years and raised 4 children and took care of your father until the day he died. If I want to spend my Social Security check on adventures with my friend Rose, that's my choice to make. You can support me or not, but you can't control me. Those days are over." Her daughter was shocked. Mrs. Gonzalez had always been accommodating, always put her children's preferences ahead of her own, always asked permission before making decisions about her own life. But like me, she'd reached an age where other people's approval mattered less than her own sense of purpose and joy. We made good travel companions, 2 women who'd learned late in life that we were interesting enough to entertain ourselves, brave enough to navigate unfamiliar places, and wealthy enough in the ways that mattered to finance our own small adventures. In Ireland, we traced my father's family history through county records and cemetery stones, discovering relatives I'd never known existed, and stories I'd never heard about the great-grandmother who'd run a boarding house in County Cork and raised 6 children alone after her husband died in a mining accident. The parallels weren't lost on me. Here was a woman who'd faced circumstances far more difficult than anything I'd ever encountered, who'd survived and thrived not by martyring herself for others, but by being resourceful, determined, and unwilling to let other people's opinions dictate her choices. Standing at her grave marker in a small cemetery overlooking the Irish Sea, I felt connected to something larger than my own story, part of a long line of women who'd done what needed to be done with dignity and courage, and without apology. That evening, sitting in a pub in the village where my great-grandmother had lived, Mrs. Gonzalez and I talked about the lives we'd built in our 70s, the unexpected richness that had come from finally choosing ourselves after decades of being chosen by others. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Losing your family, I mean. The way it was before." I thought about her question, sipping my beer and listening to the Irish music that reminded me of songs my father used to hum when I was very young. "I regret that it took me so long to figure out the difference between love and accommodation," I said finally. "I regret that I couldn't teach Michael better boundaries when he was young enough to learn them easily. I regret that Leo had to witness so much family dysfunction before any of us learned healthier ways to relate to each other. But do you regret losing the old relationships?" "No," I said, and realized I meant it completely. You can't lose something you never really had. What I had wasn't love. It was servitude dressed up as love. What I have now isn't perfect, but it's honest. And honesty, it turns out, is the foundation of everything else worth having. Mrs. Gonzalez nodded, raising her glass in a small toast. "To honest relationships, and to women brave enough to start over when necessary." We clinked glasses in that Irish pub. Two American women in their 70s who'd traveled thousands of miles to learn something they could have learned in their own Brooklyn neighborhood. That it's never too late to choose yourself, to demand better treatment, to build a life based on your own values rather than other people's expectations. The trip to Ireland was followed by other adventures, smaller in scope but equally meaningful. Weekend trips to museums in Philadelphia, visits to cousins I'd lost touch with years ago, day excursions to beaches and parks and historic sites I'd always meant to explore but never had time for when I was busy managing other people's crises. Each adventure taught me something new about my own capacity for independence, my ability to enjoy my own company, my resilience in navigating unfamiliar situations without anyone to lean on but myself. I started keeping a journal during these trips, not because anyone had suggested it, but because I found myself having thoughts worth preserving, insights about life and love and family that seemed important enough to record. The woman who emerged in those journal pages was someone I was proud to know, someone whose opinions mattered, someone whose story deserved to be told. Dr. Martinez had suggested I might want to share my story with other women who were struggling with similar family dynamics, women who'd spent decades being used in the name of love and didn't know how to break the pattern without losing everyone they cared about. The idea terrified me at first. Who was I to give advice? What did I know about healthy relationships that might help someone else? I was still learning, still making mistakes, still figuring out how to love people without losing myself in the process. But Dr. Martinez pointed out that sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've recently learned something difficult, who remember what it felt like to be confused and frightened and convinced that change was impossible. "Your story isn't finished," she said. "But the chapter about learning to value yourself is pretty compelling. There might be other women who need to read it." So I started speaking at the community center, sharing my story with small groups of women who were dealing with adult children who wouldn't launch, spouses who took their generosity for granted, family members who treated them like personal banks rather than beloved relatives. The response was overwhelming. Story after story of women who'd given everything to people who demanded more, who'd sacrificed their own dreams and goals and financial security to support family members who never seemed to develop the ability to support themselves. These women were tired, used up, resentful but guilty about their resentment. They knew something was wrong with the dynamic, but they'd been taught that their worth came from their usefulness, that love meant saying yes to every request, regardless of the personal cost. They were afraid of what would happen if they started setting boundaries, afraid their children would cut them off, their partners would leave, their families would fall apart without their constant intervention and support. I understood their fear because I'd lived with it for decades, but I also knew something they didn't know yet, that relationships built on one person's bottomless giving and another person's endless taking aren't actually relationships worth preserving. I thought I was going to lose everything when I stopped being available for every crisis, I told these groups, and I did lose some things. But what I lost were obligations disguised as relationships, transactions disguised as love, my own slow disappearance disguised as virtue. What I gained was myself, my own interests, my own opinions, my own right to take up space in the world. And from that foundation, I've been able to build relationships that actually nourish me, that include give and take from both sides, that honor who I am rather than just what I can provide. These presentations led to invitations to speak at other community centers, churches, women's groups. I found myself part of a loose network of women who were learning to reclaim their own lives after decades of living primarily for others. We weren't anti-family or anti-generosity. We were pro-boundaries, pro-self-respect, pro-relationships that enhanced everyone involved rather than depleting some people for the benefit of others. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply satisfying. Every woman who learned to say no to unreasonable requests was a small victory. Every story of someone who'd reclaimed her own interests and goals after years of living entirely for others was a reminder that change was possible at any age. Some of the women I spoke with were in their 40s, still young enough to potentially have decades of healthy relationships ahead of them if they could learn better patterns now. Others were my age or older, wondering if it was worth the disruption to change dynamics that had been in place for generations. I told them all the same thing, that we're never too old to start treating ourselves with respect, never too late to demand better from the people who claim to love us, never too set in our ways to try a different approach if the old approach isn't working. The responses to my story varied. Some family members were supportive, even grateful that someone had finally spoken honestly about patterns they'd recognized but hadn't known how to address. Others were defensive, angry that their behavior was being questioned, resistant to any suggestion that they might need to change their expectations. The defensiveness didn't surprise me. When you've been getting your needs met through someone else's endless availability, that person's sudden unavailability feels like betrayal rather than growth. When you've been accustomed to someone else solving your problems, their decision to let you solve your own problems feels like abandonment rather than respect for your capabilities. But I'd learned that other people's anger about my boundaries wasn't my problem to solve. My job was to maintain the boundaries, to stay true to the values I'd identified as important, to refuse to be drawn back into dynamics that had proven unhealthy for everyone involved. This was perhaps the hardest lesson of all, that you can't control how other people respond to your growth, can't make them happy about your decision to stop being chronically available for their convenience, can't prevent them from trying to guilt or manipulate you back into old patterns. All you can control is your own behavior, your own choices, your own commitment to treating yourself with the same kindness and respect you've always shown others. Sometimes that means disappointing people. Sometimes it means being called selfish by people who've benefited from your selflessness. Sometimes it means losing relationships that were important to you, even if they weren't healthy for you. But the alternative, going back to being invisible in your own life, valuable only for what you can provide, loved only conditionally based on your willingness to give endlessly, isn't really an alternative at all. It's slow suicide disguised as virtue. Now, 5 years after that day in the courtroom when I chose truth over comfortable lies, I can say with certainty that the temporary discomfort of disappointing people who expected me to sacrifice myself for their benefit was absolutely worth the long-term joy of living as myself. I wake up each morning in an apartment I love, surrounded by art I've created, and books I've chosen, and plants I tend because I enjoy their beauty, not because someone else expects me to maintain them. I spend my days doing work that matters to me, with people whose company I genuinely enjoy, pursuing interests that reflect my own personality rather than someone else's expectations of what a woman my age should want to do. I have relationships now that include mutual care, shared interests, genuine affection that doesn't depend on my ability to solve problems or provide financial support. Not many relationships, but enough, and all of them honest. Most surprisingly, I have hope. Hope for continued adventures, continued growth, continued opportunities to be useful in ways that don't require me to be invisible. Hope that the years ahead will be as rich and meaningful as these past 5 have been, maybe more so as I continue learning who I am when I'm not performing for other people's approval. The woman I've become isn't perfect. She's sometimes lonely, occasionally uncertain, still learning how to navigate relationships that don't follow the old patterns of endless giving and grateful receiving. But she's real in a way the old me never was, honest in a way that creates space for genuine intimacy, strong in a way that comes from knowing she can survive disappointing people who matter to her. If you're listening to this story and seeing yourself reflected in the woman I used to be, I want you to know that change is possible. Not easy, not quick, not without losses and complications and periods of doubt, but possible. You deserve relationships that see and value who you are, not just what you can do for others. You deserve to take up space, to have preferences, to say no to requests that feel overwhelming or manipulative. You deserve to be loved for yourself, not for your willingness to disappear so others can be comfortable. The path to that kind of life starts with small steps, saying no to one request that doesn't feel right, expressing one preference that's different from what others want, spending one afternoon doing something you enjoy instead of something someone else needs. It starts with the radical idea that your own well-being matters, that your own happiness is worth pursuing, that your own life is valuable enough to live on your own terms. It starts with choosing yourself, maybe for the first time, definitely not for the last time, because choosing yourself isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily practice, a commitment you make over and over again as you learn what it means to love others without losing yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing that our lives matter, that our struggles have meaning, that it's never too late to start treating ourselves with the respect we've always shown others. The sun is setting now outside my window, painting Brooklyn in shades of gold and possibility. Tomorrow will bring new choices, new opportunities to practice the self-respect I'm still learning, new chances to live the truth I'm still discovering. But tonight, I'm content. Tonight, I'm enough. Tonight, I'm home.